Picture a snake so heavy it would crush a car, and so long it could stretch across a basketball court with room left over. That was Titanoboa. Around 58 million years ago, in what's now the Cerrejon coal mine in Colombia, this thing slid through swamp water at roughly 42 feet long and over 1,000 kilograms. Nothing about it followed the rules of a normal snake. It was too big to ambush prey on land, too heavy to climb, and it could only exist because of one bizarre condition on Earth that no longer exists. Here's why. Start with the size, because the size is the part that still breaks people's brains. The largest snake alive today is the green anaconda, and a truly enormous one might reach 20 feet and weigh a couple hundred pounds. That's already a monster. Titanoboa was more than double that length and, according to the Smithsonian, weighed somewhere in the range of a ton. Picture the thickest part of its body, coming up to your waist while it's lying flat on the ground. Not its head reared up. Just the middle of it, resting as tall as your hip. And nobody went looking for it. The Cerrejon mine is one of the biggest open-pit coal operations on the planet, and paleontologists were poking around in the exposed rock because coal forms from ancient swamp forests, which means ancient swamp forests means fossils. They started pulling up giant turtle shells and crocodile bones. Then, a few vertebrae showed up that looked like they belonged to a snake, except the proportions were all wrong. They were too big. The team initially assumed the bones came from something else entirely, because no snake was supposed to be that size. Here's the detail that makes the discovery work. You can actually calculate roughly how long and heavy a snake was from a single vertebra, because in snakes, the size of the backbone scales tightly with the size of the whole animal. So when researchers ran the numbers on the Cerrejon vertebrae, and the answer came back at around 42 feet, they ran them again. The species was formally described in 2009 in the journal Nature by a team led by Jason Head, and the name they gave it, Titanoboa cerrejonensis, just means Titanic boa from Cerrejon. Honest naming at least. So that's abnormal thing number one. A snake that simply should not be able to get that big. Which brings us straight to abnormal thing number two, because once an animal is that heavy, the way it hunts has to change completely. When you imagine a giant snake, you probably imagine the classic move. It hides, it waits, it strikes, it wraps around something and squeezes. That's how a python or an anaconda kills. The problem is that this playbook gets harder the bigger you become. At over 1,000 kilograms, Titanoboa was almost certainly too heavy to do much sneaking around on dry land. It couldn't dart out of the underbrush in a flash. It couldn't climb a tree and drop. Gravity simply does not allow a creature that massive to be quick and nimble out of water. So it didn't really live the life of a land ambush predator. The evidence points to a snake that spent most of its time in the water, where its own weight basically stops mattering. Water holds you up. A body that's a crushing burden on land becomes a smooth, gliding thing once it's submerged. And the same Cerrejon rock that gave up the snake also gave up its neighbors, which tells you what was on the menu, from giant lungfish and big bony fish to crocodile relatives and turtles the size of a kiddie pool. That's a meaningfully different animal than the one in the nature documentaries. There's even an ongoing scientific debate about whether Titanoboa relied on constriction at all, or whether its real specialty was simply seizing huge slippery prey in the water with a jaw built for the job. Researchers studying its skull have suggested it may have been more of a fish eater than a classic squeeze and swallow killer. Either way, the picture is the same. This was not a land snake scaled up. It was something closer to a giant aquatic reptile that happened to be shaped like a serpent. If you're enjoying this one, the channel is full of deep dives on prehistoric animals that rewrote the rules, so Stick around for more. Because the most interesting question isn't really how Titanoboa hunted. It's how it was allowed to exist in the first place. This is abnormal thing number 3, and it's the one that the locked-in title is really about. Snakes are ectotherms. They don't generate their own body heat the way you and I do. They borrow it from the world around them, from sun and warm air and warm water. And here's the part that controls everything. The bigger a cold-blooded animal gets, the warmer its environment has to be just to keep its body running. So the scientists flipped the whole thing around. Instead of only asking how big the snake was, they used the snake to ask how hot the world was. The logic goes like this. If you know the size of an ectotherm, and you know how ectotherm metabolism works, you can estimate the minimum temperature the surrounding environment needed to hit for that animal to survive. Run that math on Titanoboa, and the answer is brutal. The tropics back then needed to sit at an average yearly temperature of roughly 30 to 34 degrees Celsius. Not the daytime peak. The average. Sit with that for a second. Today's tropical rainforests, the hottest, steamiest places on the planet, average a few degrees cooler than that. Which means the swamp Titanoboa lived in was hotter year-round than anywhere a rainforest exists now. The planet during that early stretch after the dinosaurs died out was running a fever, and that fever is the only reason a snake could scale up to a ton. The heat was the engine. Take the heat away, and the engine cuts out. That's the bizarre condition from the start of this video, the one that no longer exists. There is no place on Earth today warm enough, for long enough, across a big enough swampy lowland, to grow and sustain a 42-foot ectotherm. The world simply doesn't run that hot anymore. So even setting aside extinction and the millions of years that have passed, you couldn't get a Titanoboa now. The climate that built it is gone. And that flips a fear most people carry into something almost reassuring. The reason there's no monster snake lurking out there waiting to break the size record isn't luck. It's thermodynamics. The ceiling on snake size is set by how warm the planet is, and the planet cooled off. Titanoboa wasn't a snake that beat the rules. It was a snake that lived during the brief window, when the rules themselves were different. So go back through the 3 things that made it impossible. The size, more than double any living snake, calculated from a backbone. The lifestyle, a water hunter built for giant fish instead of a land squeezer, because its own weight forced the change. And the climate, a tropic so hot that the snake's existence basically functions as a thermometer pointed at the deep past. Each one of those is strange on its own. Stack all 3 together and you get an animal that genuinely could not happen today, in any form, anywhere. That's the thing about Titanoboa. It isn't a bigger version of something you already know. Every single rule you'd use to picture a snake gets bent or broken to fit it. Too big to ambush. Too heavy to climb. Surviving only because the whole planet was hotter than the hottest jungle alive. Nothing about it was normal, and that's exactly why a coal mine in Colombia turned out to be hiding the most extraordinary serpent that ever lived. If you want more stories like this, where one fossil quietly rewrites what we thought was possible, there's plenty more waiting on the channel.